Stanford University.
Welcome. My name is Dr. Tia Rich, and I'm the Director of Contemplation by Design. It's my honor to welcome Jeremy Lent, who will be speaking to us this evening about weaving the web of meaning, sustainable flourishing, rooted in recognizing interrelatedness. Jeremy is an author and speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways toward a life-affirming future. His award-winning book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, examined the ways humans have made meaning from the cosmos, from hunter-gatherer times to the present day. His new book, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, offers a solid foundation for a worldview based on connectedness that could lead humanity to a sustainable, flourishing future. He is founder of the nonprofit Liology Institute and writes topical articles exploring the deeper patterns of political and cultural developments at Patterns of Meaning. Let's give a warm-hearted welcome to Jeremy Lent.
Thank you so much, Tia, for that lovely introduction. And it's just a delight for me to be back here at the Contemplation by Design Summit after talking at one when we were in person just a few years back. What I'm going to do, as Tia said, I'm going to start off with a presentation that's got some slides and share my screen in a moment. And then we're going to have a few minutes of reflection that I'll prompt. And I want to try to save a good amount of time at the end, maybe as much as 40 minutes or so, for a full discussion with questions that you can ask in the Q&A as I'm speaking. So as I'm talking, if any questions do arise, please feel free to put them in the Q&A so that we can then really kind of go into the questions and issues that are most important to you later on. So now I'm going to share my screen. It looks like everyone's seeing what the talk is going to be about tonight, weaving the web of meaning, as Tia said, sustainable flourishing, rooted in interconnectedness. And I thought, and given how this Contemplation by Design Week is structured, I thought a nice place to actually begin this talk today is using a phrase that I noticed was the title of the talk that occurred yesterday, Contemplating Earth, Our Only Home. And, when we look at that picture of Earth, as I'm sure was talked about yesterday, we know, here it is in the middle of this sort of vast and potentially bleak universe, the only place that we know of in the universe that has life. Maybe there's life elsewhere, but we don't know about it. And life evolved on this planet billions of years ago, quite early in that planet's history. But it's only been the last couple of 100,000 years that a certain species arose that developed the power to actually affect every other aspect of life on this planet. So, a reasonable question is to ask ourselves from this perspective, well, how have we been doing with that so far? And as we know only too well, just from our own personal experience or just watching the news from one day to the next, we're doing a lousy job. And not only are we doing a lousy job, but it looks like things could get even worse. Everywhere we look now in the world, we see wildfires out of control, we see floods out of control, terrible droughts all around the world. And we're all only too aware that this is a result of a climate emergency that we're facing. And this is obviously particularly timely since the COP26 talks are about to begin next week in Glasgow. And what we've most people who have been watching the news recognize right now is that actually we're on track at the way things are going for a catastrophic rise in global temperature to anything from 3 to 5 degrees. And even if by some very positive confluence of events, nations were able to come up with their commitments for a 2 degrees rise in temperature, even that's been called by scientists as a prescription for disaster. Even the 1.5% that's almost like our only like wild hope right now is considered by many scientists being not a safe target because of this zone of cascading amplifying feedbacks that occur from results of global heating. But here's the thing, climate change itself is really only a symptom of something even deeper, a much deeper problem that we're facing in humanity's relationship with the world. We're looking at really way beyond climate, vast ecological destruction across the board. Since 1970 alone, there has been a 68% decline in animal populations across the world by average population. We're looking right now as a result of that and just our overall depredation of species, the 6th great extinction of species beginning now since life began on Earth. The other 5 came through things like asteroids or whatever. This one is caused, will be caused if we don't stop it, by our own species action. We're looking at the annihilation virtually of coral reefs worldwide, maybe as soon as by the middle of this century. And the UN themselves forecast that, again, by that time, roughly 95% of Earth's land will be degraded. But if there's one statistic that just kind of blows my mind more than any of these other ones, it's this one, that by 2050, at the current rates, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. Now, all of this is the result of what's been called by Earth scientists as the great acceleration in all kinds of production, consumption, human activity that has mostly happened since really the end of the Second World War. You can see just by looking at this picture, just virtually any measure you look at, it just kind of exploded and continues to explode since the Second World War. But here is what's amazing. Normal mainstream economists predict that this level of consumption and production, global GDP, is going to triple by the middle of this century. So all this devastation we've seen so far, now we're looking at a tripling of that production and consumption, which is why scientists are telling us we're rapidly heading for a precipice. Some scientists a few years back developed a model of what they called a safe operating space for humanity, which you can see right here, where they looked at planetary boundaries of the different levels we shouldn't go beyond. We've already broken through 4 of those 9 planetary boundaries. And that's why world scientists now are saying things like they're publishing warnings to humanity, saying like soon it will be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. Another very prominent Earth scientist says there's a very big risk we will end our civilization if we continue down this present path. And ex-UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon told world leaders just a few years back, this is a global suicide pact. So when we're looking at this, it's very reasonable to ask, how did we get to this place? What's going on? And I actually looked at that in some detail in this book that I discussed here at Stanford a few years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And what that book showed, it looked at all the way different cultures made meaning of the universe, all the way from hunter-gatherer times to the present. And one thing that distilled out of that book is this sort of key recognition that culture shapes values. And those values are what actually shape history. And by the same token, our values are what will shape the future. So let's take a look. What are our values right now? in our dominant culture. And I think what's clear is that our values are based on separation. I view this picture as kind of iconic for our values right now, where people are like separate from each other, connected with their technology, separate even from the food they're getting, barely even thinking about where it might have come from. And underlying the way that we live our lives is a story, a modern story of separation, which is not necessarily spoken explicitly, but underlies virtually every conversation that takes place, every debate that is talked about. And it goes something like this, that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature. In fact, humans are separate from each other. And that human progress arises from the conquest of nature. And that as such, the earth is seen really as a resource to exploit for human benefit. And ultimately, the purpose of this whole thing, the purpose arising from this worldview, is basically just to get wealthy and powerful. But in this new book that recently came out called The Web of Meaning, that I'll be taking you through today, what this web of meaning is about. What I show and what we'll be exploring today is how every one of those elements of that modern story of separation is actually false. And in this book, and in what we'll be exploring today, what we're going to see is how the findings of modern sciences, such as neuroscience and complexity science, evolutionary biology or system sciences, point to the same deep realization that traditional wisdom has talked about for millennia, whether it's indigenous knowledge or Taoism or Buddhism, this realization of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And we're going to look, as we explore this, to structure this, which is actually how the book itself is structured, by looking at some of the key existential questions that pretty much every human being asks at some point in their life, even if they don't use exactly these words. But questions like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? And in each of these cases, we're going to look at the question and see what our dominant culture tells us is the answer to that question. And then look at what a worldview of deep interconnectedness might point to as a very different kind of answer. So we're going to begin with that first question, who am I? And when we do ask this question, pretty much every answer we get from our dominant culture comes ultimately from the source of this, this most famous statement, probably in all of philosophy, by Descartes, all the way back from the 17th century, that famous statement, cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And if you look at what is underlying that question, what it basically says is that human identity itself exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty. And that as a result, other animals who don't have that conceptualizing faculty, and even our bodies themselves, are mere machines that sort of identity of our conceptualizing, that thinking capacity, is housed in. But what modern biologists and ethologists now understand is that animals are most definitely not machines. We now know that elephants can communicate with other herds over hundreds of miles through infrasound. We know that they perform ceremonies over dead family members. And we now understand that dolphins and whales, they have complex language. They are even believed to talk to each other in local dialects. Scientists think that they call each other out by name, and they've even believed to gossip about those who are temporarily absent. We know that wolves show deep family commitment. Males will help raise the young for years until they reach maturity. But what's so fascinating is that it's not just these high functioning mammals that we know are clearly not like just these basic machines, but now biologists, as they study plants, they've discovered that plants themselves have a profound networked intelligence. Their intelligence is a distributed kind of intelligence. Plants now are known to have up to 20 different senses with which they relate to the environment. Senses similar to the 5 senses we know, and a whole bunch of others that we can't even conceive how they might feel. And then plants are known now to act intentionally and purposefully. We discovered that plants learn, they have memories, and they even communicate with each other. The biologist Suzanne Simard, in studying forests, has discovered that through the mycorrhizal fungal network under the earth, plants' roots actually create what she calls a wood wide web, where they can communicate all through the forest and even use that network to allocate resources as a community. And what I find most amazing is that even when we go to the fundamental tiniest element of life, a microscopic cell we can't even see, even cells biologists now recognize display stunning intelligence. It's quite awe-inspiring what a single cell can do. A single cell has thousands of different sensors and proteins. It sends and receives hundreds of different signals at a time. A cell is aware of itself and others. It knows what to do from second to second. Cells cooperate in community. And we've even discovered how they make decisions as a group. And we have roughly 40 trillion of these cells in each of our bodies. Now, this discovery of the innate intelligence in nature is something that modern biology has only just begun to uncover. And that's begun to sort of disrupt this old worldview from our modern times. But in other cultures, this understanding of the deep intelligence in nature was always right there in the way that they made sense of things. And if we look at all the way back over roughly 2,500 years ago in ancient China, to one of the great classics of human wisdom, the Daoda Ching. Many of us will know that the word Tao itself means something like way or path, how the forces of nature like manifest in the world. But those early Taoists were also fascinated by a concept that they called De, which is where the word Daoda Ching comes from, which can roughly be translated as something like the spontaneity that's intrinsic in nature, that's inherent in all living things. And when these Taoists looked at nature around them, the state of acting with De, they knew as Wu Wei, they called it, effortless action. That's how Wu Wei translates in English. And when they looked at what all other beings did, whether birds or animals or plants, they saw that these non-human organisms acted naturally in Wu Wei. And so they asked, what happened to humans? Rather than this Wu Wei of effortless action, humans, they saw, seemed to act in almost the opposite kind of way, what they called purposive action, or Yu Wei. And they described that as things like Yu Wei is something like using a fire to dry up a well, or forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And you might say, well, aren't those the very things that kind of define us as humans? Isn't that what our whole civilization is based on? Is that kind of Yu Wei action? And the Taoists would have said, yeah, absolutely. That's from that basis, they developed a theory of civilization, which went something like this. This is from a quote from Zhuangzi, who's one of the great Taoist sages. He talked about how in the ancientest of times, the men of old belonged to the whole world in what was a state of perfect unity. People lived in common with the birds and beasts, he says, and were on terms of equality with all creatures, like forming one family, he said. And then civilization came along, and people began everywhere in his words, to be suspicious with extravagant orchestras and gesticulating ceremonies. Men began to be separated from one another. So that was the way the Taoists saw how civilization arose. And what is fascinating is that modern cognitive neuroscience validates precisely that Taoist theory of civilization. We now know that the uniquely advanced prefrontal cortex in human beings is what mediates that Yu-way cognition, that purposive thinking. And it's what mediates our ability to have symbolic thoughts, our conceptualizing, planning, creating abstractions. And what is so fascinating is that cognitive anthropologists, now when they look at how humans really developed as modern humans and how culture began, they really see that symbolic thought as being the foundation for things like language, culture, art, and tool making, just like the Taoists said. So we now know from our cognitive neuroscience that we actually have a dual human consciousness, that we do have, just as Descartes talked about, that kind of conceptual consciousness that's analytic, rational, effortful, what the Taoists called Yu-way. But we also have, along with all other animals and living sentient beings around us, an animate consciousness that's intuitive, fast, through which we feel our emotions. It's effortless. Basically what the Taoists saw as Wu-way, which leads to our real human challenge is not to just identify with that I think, therefore I am conceptual intelligence, but to integrate both of those systems in harmony. So now when we go back to that first question, who am I? On the basis of this, we can begin to answer that by saying, well, I am a mind-body organism capable of integration. So let's turn now to the second question, where am I? So we know that what our mainstream dominant culture tells us where we are is that basically we live in a split universe of some kind. And we're told basically there's some sort of dimension out there with a transcendent God, and there's a material world below. And those two dimensions of the universe don't really necessarily relate to each other, which is why most of us are comfortable with this notion in mainstream thought that religion and science really exist in different domains, that religion's up there somewhere and science deals with the stuff that happens here in the material world. But that split way of understanding the universe is also what's led to our unsustainable worldview, where it's considered okay and fine to pray to that source of transcendent meaning, even while we ransack nature below. But that split universe is not how other cultures around the world saw the universe for millennia. And if we go back again to China, to ancient China, but this time actually traditional China from about 1,000 years ago in the Song dynasty, there was a very interesting worldview that arose there from a group of sages that called themselves the School of the Tao. And this group, about 1,000 years ago in China, synthesized, integrated three different ways of thinking that had been dominant in China for the last millennium before then. Taoism that we were just looking at, Confucianism, and Buddhism that had arrived in China originally from India. And when they synthesized these three different traditions, they called themselves the School of the Tao, but we know this group nowadays by the term Neo-Confucianism. And the Neo-Confucianists developed a sense of the entire cosmos by synthesizing these three lines of thought in the following way. They saw the entire universe as consisting of what they called qi, which we can translate in today's terms as kind of like matter and or energy, all the stuff of the universe. But crucially, they said that qi of the universe only can be manifested by what they called li, the principles by which the qi is connected. And so the li they saw as the principles of connection that put all of the different qi together in different forms. And the totality of all the Li in the universe was what they understood as the Tao. Now, if we fast forward 1,000 years to modern science, what we find is that system sciences across the board also point to a connected universe, whether it's complexity science, systems biology, or chaos theory. What they all show is that when we look at the universe, we discover that actually everything is connected and in non-linear ways. So, for example, the founder of chaos theory some decades ago, Edward Lorenz, posed this famous question some of you may have heard of. He said, is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could cause a tornado in Texas? I'm not saying that it would, but just because of these complex ways in which everything relates, this is the sort of nonlinear way in which complex systems actually interact. And what many of these system scientists now recognize is that the interactions between things often tell us more about them than the things themselves. Whether we're looking at like starlings flocking in the sky, or the schools of fish in the ocean, or the ripples of sand dunes, or the entire weather or complex system of earth science, or even the way galaxies are organized. It's oftentimes the way they interact that tell us more about them than the stuff they're made of. Now, that's a hard notion sometimes for us to get our heads around, especially when we brought up in our dominant culture. So I'm going to ask you for a moment to pause and think for yourself about a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. So think of that. You've got that in mind. And here is a picture of me when I was a little kid. Now, when I look at that picture of me, I know that was me. I've even got the memories to prove it. But here's the thing. There's not a single molecule in that little boy that is in me now. Almost all of the cells in that little boy are no longer part of me. There are some cells that stay with us throughout an entire lives, but even those cells are always continually changing the molecules that they're comprised of. So I can be virtually certain that the things that that little boy was made of, the chi or the matter, is utterly different from me now. And yet there's this coherence between me and that little boy. That was me. So what is it that connects me with that little boy? Well, basically, it's the ways in which all that stuff organize themselves in coherent patterns that remain actually more stable, more important than even the stuff, the molecules making up that little boy. That's what the Neo-Confucians refer to as the Li, and what modern system science sees as so crucial in understanding our universe. And when system scientists look at these universal patterns in nature, there's one particularly important one they see, which they call fractals. A fractal is a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. It indicates self-organized activity wherever we see it, and it's everywhere in the natural world. We see it in like the patterns on coastlines, or the patterning on leaves, on lightning, or even within us, in our lungs, and in our neurons. And now system scientists have begun to recognize that nature itself is really a fractally connected system, where every living cell is organized according to similar principles to that of the organism of which it's part, which is fractally a part of the species which it's part. And the species are a fractal part of the ecosystem. And each of these ecosystems are ultimately fractally connected with the living earth or with Gaia. So now when we look at that question, where am I? Using these insights, we can begin to answer that in a very different way. We can begin to say that I am actually part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. Which leads us actually to this third question. What am I? Well, to begin to answer this question, it's helpful to actually begin with a great insight by one of those Neo-Confucian sages from about 1,000 years ago. Chu Shi was his name. And he said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. So if we ask ourselves, if we ask that what the modern worldview tells us about our own nature, well, we get a pretty clear answer that was probably best popularized by Richard Dawkins some decades ago when he wrote the book, The Selfish Gene, which has now kind of permeated modern culture almost through and through. And in his words, and what most people take for granted, we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And as a result, he says, a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. And as a result of not just Dawkins, but many of those kind of older ways of understanding biology, we've now come to believe in modern culture that the gene is the fundamental unit of evolution, that it dictates everything about the organism, that it's inherently selfish and competitive. But what modern findings in biology tell us is that every one of those beliefs about the gene that we thought was scientifically valid is actually false. It turns out that the gene is really part of an iterative process with the cell itself, that the gene and the cell it's in work in a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity. Biologists now understand that we should begin to see the genotype itself more like an artist's palette, like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. So this is a very different understanding than what we're used to thinking. But there's one fascinating example that shows how powerful this different way of understanding the gene-cell interaction really is. Think for a moment of a grasshopper. We all know and love grasshoppers, right? A gentle, solitary creature munching away on a leaf, biding its time, doing its own thing. Well, it turns out that grasshopper has exactly the same DNA as a horrendous herd of millions and millions of locusts, aggressive swarms that we know can devour millions of acres of land in just a few hours. And what that grasshopper does is it actually chooses at certain times, based on the environment, based on cues it gets, to actually change the way its genes are expressed within its cells to actually turn itself into a locust. And just as easily at some point, and those locusts can change the expression of their DNA to turn themselves back into gentle, solitary grasshoppers again. So this shows how the gene definitely doesn't dictate by itself or control the cell. But what about the selfishness? If we just move the selfishness from the gene to the organism? Well, this is another discovery now of modern biology. If we look at the evolution of the complexity of life since it began on Earth billions of years ago, there have only been a few major stages in life's jump up in its complexity, from single cells to complex cells, to multicellular life, to simple animals, and then to mammals. And what's fascinating is biologists now recognize that every one of those steps in increased complexity actually came about not through greater competition, but through increases in cooperation, where different entities, different organisms learned that by working together more effectively, they could actually create more complexity and actually make basically a better life for all. So life itself evolved through cooperation. In the words of the great systems biologist, Lynn Margulis, she said, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And one key element of that networking is what we see in this picture, where we see the bee pollinating the flower and getting food and pollinating at the same time. And this is the fundamental of what's known as mutually beneficial symbiosis, which really forms the sort of underlying music, if you will, for what we can think of as the harmonic dance of life. And if you walk in a forest and just look and just part of everything around you, this whole richness of life around us actually comes as a result of symbiosis, where plants photosynthesize and provide nourishment for other animals. Insects pollinate those plants. Animals transport their seeds, and they fertilize the ground for those plants. The fungus regenerates the earth based on the dead matter that's there. And as we saw before, those mycorrhizal networks are used by the plants to transport nutrients elsewhere around. This dance of symbiosis. And that's why another great systems biologist, Carl Woese, says we need to look at organisms themselves as being self-organized, fractal, dynamic patterns, resilient patterns, he says, in a turbulent flow. As he says, we have to see them not materialistically as machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. And it's that organization that forms this incredible fractal cascade of abundance that we can get such pleasure in the earth, the life, the way it is today. So that leads us, when we begin to look at this question now, what am I? From this new perspective of connectedness, we can begin to answer that question as well. I am really a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation, which leads, I think, naturally to this next question: how should I live? And if we start again by just looking at what our dominant culture tells us, well, it's pretty straightforward. We're told that, humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy, that's basically who we naturally are. And as a result of that, selfish behavior by individuals is natural and is in the best interest of everyone. There's that famous quote from Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street that came out some decades ago: greed is good. And that really became the foundation for our modern ideology of neoliberalism that's now taken over the world. But what's fascinating, even those who don't agree with the ideology of neoliberalism are still stuck in that mode of thinking. And to his credit, Richard Dawkins is one of those who disavows that selfish neoliberalism. But what he says, and what people generally think, is that we have to overcome our selfish genes. In his words, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish. And if we understand our selfish genes, then we can upset their designs. But again, that has been shown to be absolutely false by findings in modern biology and anthropology. We now know that humans actually evolved to be cooperative. Millions of years ago, early pre-humans, hominids, when they found themselves in the savannah, were vulnerable to predators. It was those who learned to collaborate that were most successful. And over time, the identity of each human, each pre-human, expanded from just the self and kin to include their entire group. So that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. And as a result of that, we humans, over millions of years, developed what are known nowadays by psychologists as moral emotions. Things like compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. These are things that are deeply felt within us. They're not things that we tell ourselves we should be thinking. And we don't just act morally because we think we should, because we overcome that selfishness. We do so because it actually feels right. Now, traditional and indigenous cultures around the world have always understood that. In Africa, there's this key concept in many parts of Africa called Ubuntu, which roughly translates as I am because you are. Here in North America, the Lakota have a phrase, mitakuye oyasin, which means we are all related. And they're not just talking about their own kin, they're talking about every living entity with whom they share the earth, seeing all of nature as family. And so as a result of that, we can now see that our flourishing is actually based on our intrinsic connectedness, the connectedness with the selves, within ourselves, with others, with the natural world, with the entire living earth. And it's not just a connectedness, but it's a fractal connectedness. This notion that human flourishing is actually fractal, where every human mind-body organism is really a fractal part of our communities, organized according to the similar principles. And our communities are all ultimately fractal parts of the living earth. And this recognition of seeing ourselves basically as part of life leads to a very different value system, which is really best expressed, I think, at least one of the best expressions was Albert Schweitzer, the great 20th century humanitarian, who said, "I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live." And as a result, in his words, "I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality." So now when we look at this question, how should I live? We can start to answer that question from a very different foundation. I should live in reverence and care for all life. Which leads us now, let's conclude by looking at this final question: why am I? And if we turn again to that dominant mindset, the answer to that question is pretty bleak and pretty clear. It was best expressed probably by the Nobel Prize winning laureate Steven Weinberg, a physicist, a famous reductionist, who said basically we live in a pointless universe. The more the universe seems comprehensible, in his words, the more it also seems pointless. So as a result, his answer to that question is there is no answer to that question. Everything's pointless. But now, as we begin to look at the implications of a worldview of deep interconnectedness, we can begin to understand meaning itself as being a function of that connectedness. We see in every interconnected complex system, as the number of connections increases, they lead to phase transition, which leads to the emergence of new meaning. And we see that in systems all around us that we're embedded in. Like we know that when single words connect in complex ways, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect in our brains and nervous systems, when enough of them connect, consciousness emerges. And I imagine many of you have had at some point in your life some sense, some sort of peak experience of a sense of oneness, of a sense of the deep interconnectedness of all things, of being part of something so far greater than yourself. And we're told by mainstream modern science, well, you can have that feeling, that's great, but that's kind of spiritual stuff. That's got nothing to do with science. But from this new interconnected worldview, we can actually begin to recognize that those peak experiences, those spiritually meaningful experiences, are actually a deeply felt intuition of the great insights that science itself tells us about how the universe actually exists. And there are some profound implications to that connectedness. And it tells us that everything you do in your life creates those Lee ripples which affect everything else in the universe. Leading to this principle, it's been understood by deeply understood by traditions around the world historically, the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. So we exist in an ocean of Lee, and those Lee ripples exist within each of us. And the choices that we make, the personal choices and actions, choices to participate, maybe in regenerative community, choices to engage in the political process, all of these different choices are what ultimately weave the web of meaning in which we're all embedded. So now when we look at this final question, why am I? We can begin to answer it by saying, I am here to weave my part in the web of meaning. And perhaps if enough of us can do that together, connected, weave a fabric together, perhaps we can regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth. So what I've been taking you through is obviously discussed in a lot more detail in this book that just came out this year, The Web of Meaning. You can find out more about my work and what I write about in the website jeremylent.com and liology.org and patternsofmeaning.com. I'm now going to lead you to ask a question of yourself, really beginning with this notion of regenerating our beautiful, fragile earth. You remember some of those issues I raised at the beginning of this presentation, how basically the actions of our civilization right now, our civilization of separation, is destroying so much of life on this beautiful earth. And what I'm going to ask you to reflect on for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back into the main group and enjoy a Q&A together. But I ask you to reflect for yourself, what is the unique thread that life is asking me to weave in the web of meaning? And as you ponder this question, what I invite you to do is not just look at the things that you're already doing that may be wonderful, that are weaving this web of meaning, but what are the really big asks that life has of you as it's suffering this destruction it has right now? What is it that you can do to really play your part in this web of meaning right now? So at this point, I'm going to stop my sharing, and I think we're back in our regular view, and let's pause for about 5 minutes while I ask you to ponder that question yourself, which I will put into the chat right now so that it's easier for everyone to focus your attention on specifically what I'm asking you to think about. What is the unique thread that life is asking me to weave in the web of meaning? Well, thank you for taking that time to consider this question, which to me feels like one of the most important questions we can all be asking ourselves right now, as we're seeing so much unraveling in the world today. And I think at this time, let's all turn our attention back to the group as a whole. And as I understand it, a number of people have already put questions into the Q&A and or chat. I think we're encouraging people to put questions in the Q&A, but I think there are a couple in the chat also. And I think Tia and Clara are going to read out some of these, and I'll attempt to answer them. And keep those questions coming. As you hear things being discussed, something comes to your mind, just put that into the Q&A, and let's really use this format to have a full-on conversation. So thanks. So Tia, would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I'll begin with the question that is about personal practice, and it writes, how do you get in touch with your interconnectedness in the world? What does your personal practice look like?
Yeah, thank you for that. For me, really, there were a few crucial elements of that personal practice, which, by the way, I'll touch on a little bit more in that Liology talk we'll be doing on Saturday, because really I'd almost say my own practices could be called my form of Liology, like this investigation of these connections. And one of those for me is meditation, sitting meditation. And for me, the form of meditation that I really like to practice is a full, open, not just acceptance, but a full welcoming of every moment, and recognizing that each moment is treasured as that present moment. And that to me is a foundation for all kinds of practices of connectedness. But perhaps just as important for me is also comes from the traditional Chinese way of practices. Qigong is crucial to my own sense of well-being, and Tai Chi equally important. And for me, when I engage in something like Qigong, which basically involves movement practices and embodied practices where you're deeply connecting with all the different energy levels within the body, something shifts. Like even when I'm in deep meditation, there's still in my own perception, something like a mind being aware of its body. So the sort of domain of which I'm coming from is still the mind. But when I'm in Qigong, something shifts, and it's like I become the body, and I become the body that is aware that it has a mind. And so it really allows me to be much more that fully, truly integrated mind-body organism. But then beyond those, other practices to me that are equally important is the deep connection with nature. It's connecting with the natural world, is recognizing every being as being sentient, as having those feelings, as being part of our family. So that in itself is a sort of practice, it's an ongoing practice to really undo the sense of what we call maybe human supremacy, the sense of ourselves as humans and separate, and really seeing myself as part of all life, part of all humanity, and shifting my identity to the place where I don't lose the identity of who I am as a separate organism, but recognizing that ultimately I am part of all life. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Building upon the inquiry into practice, there's a question that asks, in your experience, what kinds of learning experience can best support an understanding of this interconnectedness?
Yes, thanks. So that's that sense of learning is obviously very broad-based. And so if we spend just a moment thinking of learning in the more conventional view of what can be taught at schools or whatever, I think one of the most important things is right away from early times, people to learn about ecological systems, and actually to learn about the connectedness of all things. I feel that as people go through childhood and adolescence, they need to be taught not to just be successful cogs in this kind of consumer machine we're part of, but actually taught to what it means to really fully fulfill themselves. And I believe that one of the most important learning experiences that we can have with ourselves is notice those places of separateness, those places when we other those we don't agree with, or those places when we see ourselves as being better than or separate from others or the whole world around us. And when we notice those things, is not say, oh, that's wrong. I've got to, I'm now part of that like worldview of separation. That's what I need to overcome. But to treat that with kindness, because to me, a true principle of this whole practice of connectedness arises from kindness, which if you look at the etymology of kindness itself, it comes from the word kin, which means like recognizing that all these different things or parts and people are all part of the same family. So even those ideas or thoughts that we try to overcome, we don't have to treat as being bad or separate, but recognize that they are part of us and we can embrace them with a welcoming spirit and expand beyond them.
Thank you. Another individual writes, when meditation is hard to include in our daily life, when there's work and children and family and commutes and money concerns, what other skills can we do to stay connected, mind, body, and spirit?
I think that coming back to that place of kindness again is a crucial element here of when we find ourselves just unable to feel a sense of that connection, when we find ourselves unable to be in that sort of harmony with life around us. And we always have this opportunity to turn to that part of ourselves and to give it kindness. And I think that what we discover from meditation is that a long-term practice of meditation spills over ultimately from the mat into our daily lives. And that's why those kind of practices, when they're done while we're meditating, can become even more valuable when we are actually not in that place. But we develop those kind of neural connections to be able to connect with those parts and respond accordingly. And I believe that one of the most important things that we can do is when we find ourselves at odds with others around us, whether it's just in an office environments or other colleagues, or just politically, seeing those that seem like they're destroying the world, coming from fundamentally different places, is finding those places of deep connection, recognizing that all human beings were born ultimately with the same beating heart, wanting love, wanting warmth, wanting compassion. And that when we see people acting in ways that are the opposite of that, we can know that that's a result of, in fact, the pain and the hurt that they have had to experience in their lives that brought them to that place. And so feeling into that, feeling that deep connection allows us not to be pulled into those places of separation. And that doesn't mean giving way and letting other people who may be doing things we think are wrong just kind of walk all over us. But it means we can come from a place of a much greater strength, of a coherent connection with something bigger than just that antagonism with a moment or with another person.
Building upon that explanation and insight, we have someone speaking to the topic of trauma and centering trauma and inviting you to express your understanding of how trauma needs to be acknowledged. And specifically, the individual says, my experience and studies have led me to believe that most of our adverse personal and planetary difficulties are implicitly and explicitly related to trauma. Trauma is collective, contemporary, and historical, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Disconnection and severing often come from trauma. Most contemporary contemplative practices contribute to healing trauma, even if that is not the explicit purpose. Seems to me that if we don't directly incorporate the transformation of trauma, other solutions will not work. Your thoughts?
I think that is just so beautifully said. And I think that we need to recognize that this culture that we are brought up in, this patriarchal culture, basically is one that builds trauma directly into the childhood experience, all the way from infancy, even before coming out of the womb onwards. There's a wonderful psychologist, Dasha Narvaez, who looks at evolutionary biology and how humans evolved as nomadic hunter-gatherers. And she has a concept of what she calls the evolved nest, which is looking at how we basically, when children are born, what is a non-traumatic way of living, of growing up, is so fundamentally different from what our systems think tell us you're meant to do with children, with the discipline and these kind of patriarchal structures. So I feel that's absolutely right. And in fact, so many of the what the writer Ria Neisler calls the domination culture comes from early childhood trauma and ways of relating to it, not by overcoming it with kindness, but by like stopping it and then allowing it to become even stronger. And that's why I believe compassion practices, recognition of our deep connectedness with others is so key. And also recognizing the trauma within ourselves, recognizing that each of us have been born into this patriarchal, dominant worldview. Each of us needs to basically, as the phrase used by so many people, decolonize our minds. But again, I would reiterate that the way to do that is to recognize these places, to see where our own trauma created basically places of separation within us, in just the same way that a wound on our skin creates like a scar tissue, which is harder and tougher than the rest of our skin around us. We have those emotional calluses from our own trauma, but we don't resolve them by trying to break them down so much as by welcoming them with kindness, by knowing that they're all parts of ourselves, that each of those ways in which we responded to trauma at early ages were our little, mostly when we're very young, ways in which we try to protect our own organism. So even those voices we hear in ourselves that seem so filled with self-loathing or anger or whatever, we need to recognize that actually those voices arose within ourselves to try to protect us in a very difficult world. And by showering that with kindness, that's always available to us to then overcome those, not by beating them down, but by allowing them to be part of a bigger identity of connectivity.
Thank you. Very healing to hear that. We have two questions that are really seeking clarity and a restating of what you've already presented. One individual is not really clear about the difference between Li and Qi. And if you could just elevate that and illuminate that again.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, one simple way to think about it is that the Qi relates to the stuff of the universe, and the Li relates to the way that stuff actually relates to itself. So imagine, for example, a candle flame. And if you look at that candle flame, it looks like everything is pretty much stable, right, from one moment to the next. But actually, the molecules in that candle flame are continually changing. But it's it's the relationship between the wick and the heat and the oxygen in the air that actually causes that a sort of stable set of relationships that cause the flame to actually exist in some similar form from one moment to the next. So we can think of the Qi in that case as the molecules of oxygen and whatever they are that actually comprise the flame. But the Li is the way in which those molecules relate to each other. So the molecules can keep changing, but the flame remains the same. The Li is the relationship between things rather than the things themselves.
Thank you. In the writings about Li, were there any moments where this period of history that we were born into, that we're living in, were prophesized or foreshadowed, and commentary about them?
That's interesting. Not that I have ever seen in my understandings. I think that this period that we're in right now, that really just began in Europe in the 17th century, this kind of a very, very different worldview that's essentially taken over the world, is one that I don't really feel was even conceived of by earlier cultures. And it's something that I feel that we modern humans are only just now beginning to try to make sense of, because it did create a worldview and a way of relating to each other and the world around us that is actually very alien from how we evolved as human beings and how earlier cultures evolved.
Thank you. Another question for clarification: is the interconnectedness better found in behaviors outside conscious awareness or in conscious purposeful action? If so, i.e. outside awareness, can we create conditions that make cooperation and better living easier for human beings?
That's a profound question. I love that. And in a way, as I think about that question, I think it relates a little bit to that distinction that I was describing how the Taoists made so many years ago between Yu Wei and Wu Wei. And there's that sort of conscious sort of awareness with conscious purposeful actions, like the question said, or a sort of a general outside awareness. And I feel that it's really through that deep animate intelligence that we share with all of life that we can really feel that interconnectedness. And I think it's no surprise that because our modern worldview began with that sort of notion of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, human identity just existing in that conscious thinking faculty, that this worldview of separation came from that. But having said that, that doesn't have to mean that prefrontal cortex mediated, that sort of conceptualizing capability in us is something that's bad or that is against interconnection. I think that it's only been because our culture has basically deified it. It's sort of taken that reasoning capability and said, that is the only thing that really matters. That is what makes us humans sort of as gods, if you will. It's that thinking, separating our human thinking from the rest of all life, that has led to the separation we have right now. But we can use the same faculty that is so uniquely human, that we can be proud that humans have and really celebrate in ourselves, that thinking faculty. We can use that more for a process of integration, what I call an integration of consciousness. So if we recognize, if we go back to that original part of the presentation when I was exploring who am I, and we think that who I am is these two parts of a human consciousness, the Yu Wei thinking part and that Wu Wei feeling animate part, we can also use our conceptualizing capability, and we can use our intentionality and our practices to move more towards integrating those two parts together. And I personally, for me, a lot of what I do in my own practice is exactly that, is actually look at how I can enhance those neural pathways, basically, between my animate consciousness and my conceptual consciousness, so that my thinking capability can be more aware of the feeling tones that arise moment to moment. And those feeling tones themselves can then not be sort of at odds with what I'm doing as a person, but know that they're being heard in terms of the intentions I set. And I feel that we can apply that too when we look at our interactions with others around us.
Calls to mind your beautiful slide of the dancers
Mm,
balance with one another.
exactly.
Another question. Your talk reminds me of books like The Secret Life of Trees and documentaries like Fantastic Fungi,
Mm-hmm.
where mushrooms are used to clean oil spills or convert trash into mushrooms. What role do you see, quote, intelligent natural systems, end quote, playing in a sustainable future? And how can we support research and education around that process?
Mm. Yeah, another great question. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, I feel that the most important thing that we as humans can do and our culture can do is recognize those intelligent natural systems around us. And I just love the work of that film, Fabulous Fungi, and these recognitions of the interconnectedness of all life around us. That's something that's been ignored by our modern world. And that's something that even when we look at things like climate breakdown, people come up with solutions like geoengineering, like looking at the whole earth as this kind of broken system that we just need to kind of come up with a better technology to fix. And even more enlightened people, when they say, no, we need to come up with a more sustainable way of relating to the earth, they still see the earth more as a resource. And it's more along the lines of, if we want to kind of use this resource more sustainably, we have to be more sensible as to how we kind of exploit it. But we're talking about a different shift entirely, which I think this question was getting at, recognizing that the earth itself, the Gaia, is this deeply interconnected, intelligent system of systems. And the best thing we can do as human beings is to actually use our technologies, not give up on technology, use our technologies to actually be in the service of life, to say, like, what can we do to actually work together for mutual beneficial symbiosis between humans and the living earth? So ultimately, you could envisage, a lot of people talk about how now we're in the Anthropocene, this period when human action has so disrupted the earth. It's no longer the Holocene when we had climate that we could rely on, but it's basically a human dominated system. And that's a very unstable system. It's a perilous system. We have the opportunity to be a transformation of thinking that is needed. But there's a lot of people around the world right now who are looking at that transformation of shifting our entire civilization towards what some people call the symbiocene. Imagine an era when our human civilization didn't collapse, but is no longer on this course of destroying the living earth, which is part of, but actually looking at finding a place of mutually beneficial symbiosis between humans and the rest, all of the non-human nature on earth. That's the vision, I think, that we need to be looking at.
With that hopeful vision, in addition to your website and your books, are there any other resources that speak to the symbiocene future?
Yes, there are a ton of resources that speak to that. And one place I'd really begin is, if anybody who has my book, I have like further reading at the end of the book. So you can look at for each chapter, if you kind of get interested in really exploring this, there's so much depth around that in each of these areas. And really what this book, The Web of Meaning, is just doing is not so much trying to sort of break new ground and trying to come up with, oh, I've got some insight that isn't there, but is simply trying to weave together the incredible insights that so many different people from so many disciplines, scientific disciplines, as well as great wisdom and spiritual traditions have had over the millennia, and show that they all relate to each other. So I could sort of barely begin to touch the surface, but some of the things I'd say is to look at what modern indigenous knowledge can tell us. One great book that I give a shout out to is this book called Braiding, Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmera, who she herself is a biologist who's an Indigenous Native American who writes incredibly well about that weaving together. A similar one by an Australian Aboriginal man called Tyson Yunkaporta is called Sand Talk, who also does a beautiful job of weaving Aboriginal knowledge into systems understandings. And there's a great book by the systems biologist Andreas Weber called The Biology of Wonder, who does a wonderful job of looking at biology from the standpoint of being like really deeply connected with all of life. But I could go on and on, but probably the best thing to do is to, well, I don't want to make a plug for my book, but I really go into the resources there because there's so much there. And I guess one other I'd add, just because I want to kind of fill it out, is looking at how we can take Buddhist principles and apply them to this deep processes of political engagement. There's books by David Loy, which are fabulous books looking at how we can take the bodhisattva notion that arises from Buddhism and apply that into engagement with the systems right now. So just a few to kick off with there.
Thank you. And for those who are not familiar with the phrase bodhisattva, would you define that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So within Buddhism, there's this beautiful concept of somebody who has achieved this profound level of awakening, where they've got to sort of the highest levels of being awakened, to the point that in the traditional modes of Buddhism, which looked at sort of reincarnation, that they were able to take that step to leave behind this entire continual reincarnation of worldly suffering and just move into a place of essentially kind of eternal bliss, of being fully awakened. But at that moment, when they have that opportunity, they turn away from that. And they actually say, no, as long as there is suffering in the world, of which, my body is part of that world, I will be there to have the compassionate response to that suffering and work to alleviate the suffering. And what I find so fascinating, and I describe this in my book itself, actually, oftentimes when we come across this idea, there's this sense of, well, just imagining that place, what a profound altruism that person must have to say to that, no, I'm going to turn away just to be there to alleviate suffering. But there's a way in which we can look at that from an even deeper layer and see that there's actually a shifting in identity. Because that person, we can imagine, has finally left behind that sense of a separated self and sees themselves in all of life, in all around them. And so senses that suffering that's there. And so rather than wanting, like in the traditional Christian notion of a soul going up to heaven and to hell with those who didn't make it, too bad for them, in this place is this recognition that we are all of life. And we're driven not because we think we ought to, like I was describing in that presentation, to really work for life, but we're driven to it once our identity gets to that place of realizing that's what our true identity is.
Would you consider bodhisattva as an expression of Li?
That's interesting. Well, in my book, I actually look at how we can look at different schools, different traditions of wisdom, and look at how they relate to each other. So traditional Buddhists might be a little concerned about sort of trying to take a concept that isn't Buddhist by its own backing and sort of translating it in terms of the bodhisattva. But I feel that's actually very reasonable to do, especially given the fact that the notion Li itself actually came ultimately out of a Buddhist tradition, out of the Huayan tradition, which was Buddhist, and then came up with these concepts of seeing ourselves in this totally interdependent universe. So I think that there is this wonderful expression of Li that one of the Neo-Confucian sages talked about, which is called the Western Inscription. And I sort of paraphrase it in simple terms that he says, basically, I'm just part of earth, and sky. And like a little child, I'm embedded by my father, the universe, and my mother of earth. And all things are my companions, and all people are my brothers and sisters. And this is kind of profound way of recognizing that those layers of interdependence, those fractal layers of identity actually lead naturally to this expanded identity that I do believe is what the Bodhisattva ideal talks about. So I feel that there's a lot of interpenetration between those concepts, even if they do come from different traditions.
Mm-hmm. Wisdom finding, it's pointing in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
On a different level of language, but in the same vein of intention, there's a question of how do we become less suspicious of each other?
Mm. Yes. Well, I think that has to do, one of the most important ways we can do that is by recognizing that suspicion itself arises from our dominant worldview. And this is worldview that tells us that humans are separate from each other, that everyone's in competition with everybody else. And I do feel that from a place of expanded identity, we can get into a place where if we can find ways of relating with others that don't get stuck in that kind of zero-sum game. Because if we can look for places of mutual beneficial symbiosis, we don't need to see ourselves so much in competition with others. There's this notion that really, like, if we don't see ourselves as competing with somebody, then that other person can't really take advantage of us. I mean, the very notion of somebody taking advantage of us only arises if we see ourselves in this place of competition where we're trying to score against each other. So I feel always looking for that greater level of connectedness is the way in which we can overcome, I think, much of the suspicion that our modern dominant culture kind of instills in almost every conversation out there.
Thank you. Another person writes, the various environmental crises urgently require action. Are the solutions offered by your talk and your perspective and the process of weaving the web of meaning able to address the issues with the speed needed for mankind to adjust?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, speed here is the operative word, in the sense that I would say that the pathway that I kind of lay out in this talk today and in this kind of shifting worldview of interconnectedness is really foundational to the transformation that we do need as a global society. It lays the conditions for a change in direction that we need. But the question, of course, is about speed, because a very reasonable response is, we don't have time to change our worldview. I mean, we needed to get onto climate breakdown 10, 20 years ago. We need to work on it. You know, we've got maybe just 8 more years, according to so many scientists, until we've passed the point of no return to get climate back. Absolutely. So I agree with all of that. But we also, we have to be engaged right away in the short term. At the same time, there are choices that we make, which can lead more towards, which continue to reinforce this worldview of separateness, or can lead towards a worldview of deep interconnectedness. So even in the short term, there are choices that get made. And there are some things, for example, somebody might say, we need a market-based system to come up with carbon trading, and that's the way we'll sort of get emissions to come down. And what we're doing with something like that, for example, is doubling down on the very system that has caused so many of these problems in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't engage in things using the system right now that need to be done in the short term, but we need to do it with the recognition that we have to be shifting the direction itself. So we have to be looking for solutions that don't just lead to enabling us to exploit things a little bit longer before things finally break down, but to shift the trajectory itself towards a more sustainable path. So if you think of in terms of it as like a vehicle accelerating rapidly to the precipice, it's not enough to just kind of wiggle the wheel a little bit while our feet are off the gas. We need to actually transform where we're going to move away from that precipice. And that transformation can feel very uncomfortable. It can involve some skidding while it's being done. And it has to be done very skillfully. Otherwise, you can just skid off the precipice anyway. So I'm not saying that this is an easy task to do, but what I am saying is that I'm very wary, and I urge everybody to be wary of kind of what I see as false hope in the situation we're in right now. Hope that says, yeah, don't worry, this technology will solve things, or we just we can sort of keep things as they are somewhat and just make it better, and tax the fossil fuel companies, or invest more in renewables. We have to go beyond that. We have to recognize that the problems facing us are deep. And it's only when we recognize the depth of those problems, and when there is a movement around the world to rapidly make action accordingly, that we can actually begin to see the shift we need.
People are applauding your response and grateful to you for how you not only laid out the moving process of weaving the web of meaning, but how essential and relevant it is to the urgency of climate solutions.
Well, thank you so much for that. And by way of closing comments, I just would like, as I kind of touched on in that reflection I asked people to do, to recognize that the future of humanity, the future of life on Earth right now, we know is deeply impacted now by what happens over the next few years on this Earth right now. And to urge everybody to realize that this future is one that is not a spectator sport. It's one that each of us are actually engaged in, because we are embedded in this web of meaning, whether we like it or not. But even just by ignoring that and by saying, well, it's somebody else's problem, we're actually implicitly creating a future towards that destruction that we're talking about. And the future is what each of us co-creates. Every one of our intentions, our choices, our actions, what we get engaged in is what that future is going to be building. So I just kind of urge each of you to realize that, and realize that there is both a responsibility that arises out of that, but also a sense of freedom, because we're co-creating it. It's not what each of us just does alone, but what each of us is doing with each other that can allow for that possibility of a flourishing future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing your insight and your wisdom. Thank you very much for tonight.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone who was part of this today for being present. Thank you.